2,500 years ago, the island of Great Britain was a rumour. Merchants had claimed to have sailed here in search of tin, but the Greek historian Herodotus thought it was too fantastical to be included in his book. In AD 43, though, the Romans would conclusively prove that these islands were real, when they began their conquest of the land that they called Britannia. Here they would encounter the Britons, who spoke a Celtic language, Brythonic, and were divided across the island into several groups, traditionally known as tribes, and it's these tribes that I want to take a look at today. This video will focus on the north of Britain, with my other video focusing on the tribes to the south. And for the purposes of this video, the north is going to start right here. You might put the line lower, I would personally put it way higher, but people tend to disagree with that. The Greek scholar Ptolemy, during his description of Britain in his book Geography, paints a picture of a colossal tribe, stretching from sea to sea, which the Roman historian Tacitus noted was the most populous in all of Britain. These people were the Brigantes, deriving their name from the Brythonic Briganti. In Welsh today, this word survives as Brynt, meaning prestigious, but back then it might not have strictly meant someone of high status. As the Pennine Mountains run right through the north of Britain, it's been theorized that Briganti referred to someone of high elevation instead, as Ptolemy tells us that this tribe resided in 9 Roman towns situated all around these hills and mountains, naming them as Epiacum, Vinovium, Caturactonium, Calatum, Isurium, Rigodunum, Olicana, Eberacum, and Camulodunum. A few of these names still survive. Caturactonium became Catraeth in Welsh and Catterick in English, while Eberacum became Evrog in Welsh, Evorig in Old English, Jorvik by the Vikings, and finally York today. The centre of government for this tribe is disputed. The Roman government seems to have placed their capital, or civitas, right here, Isurium Brigantum, or Aldbra today. However, excavations at the fort of Stanwick has provided us with evidence for, according to the historian Barry Cunliffe, one of the only centralised settlements in all of northern Britain. In addition, this site is at the junction of 2 important trade routes, and the amount of imported Roman wares here suggests that whoever controlled this fort was very wealthy and presumably powerful, meaning that perhaps this was the old capital. We are aware of only 3 named individuals who could have ruled from here. The queen, Cartimandua, her first husband, King Venutius, and her second husband, Vellucatus. Before we get on to what we know of their history, it's important to ask what they ruled. You would expect perhaps a single kingdom or tribe, but many historians disagree. There are several locations within the territory of the Brigantes that bear the names of other tribes, such as the Setantorium Harbour and the Gabrantiocorum Bay, both of which contain nouns for apparent groups of people, the Setantii and the Gabrantovices. From this, many historians have theorized that the Brigantes were a federation, but as the historian David Breeze points out, these names come to us from Ptolemy, who was describing a tribal government that had been conquered by the Romans. Who's to say that the Brigantes always ruled over these tribes? It's not impossible, but we don't have actual evidence for this. Regardless, either in command of a federation or as a single kingdom, Queen Cartimandua became friendly with the conquering Romans, who had arrived on her borders by AD 51, becoming a very useful buffer state, allowing the Romans to focus on conquering the difficult tribes in Wales, such as the Silures and the Odoicus. However, it is this very conquest of what is now known as Wales that would cause Queen Cartimandua to fall completely out of favour. Not with the Romans, though, but with her own people. The Brigantes had already faced internal disturbances, but when the charismatic anti-Roman war leader Caractacus had fled to them seeking shelter, Cartimandua turned him into the Roman Empire. A few years later, her husband Venutius, who had previously been loyal to Rome, divorced her and started a civil war, seemingly not needing to convince many people to join him. The Romans stepped in AD 57, but the civil war continued for another decade and a half, until by AD 70, Cartimandua had been rescued from the kingdom, and Venutius ruled alone. Until a new Roman governor finally stepped in and conquered the entire region by AD 74. This would bring the boundary of this empire up to what could be argued to be one of its final frontiers. as even though they would conquer more lands such as Mesopotamia and even a bit further into Scotland, eventually both of these territories would be abandoned. Meanwhile, this border, soon to be marked with Hadrian's Wall, would stand for a couple of hundred years. This region gives us a very rough estimate for the northern extent of the Brigantes tribe, although some have tried to be a bit more precise by examining shrines to the goddess Brigantia who was worshipped here. These shrines are prevalent along Hadrian's Wall, with one found a bit further north in Brigantes in Scotland. However, these cannot reliably be used to estimate a boundary. As the historian Breeze points out, the fact that all of the northern shrines bar one are along Hadrian's Wall suggests that instead they were brought there by the army, perhaps by locally recruited Brigantes. It's also worth pointing out that all of the other shrines can be found concentrated in the south, with no shrines yet being discovered anywhere north of York apart from Hadrian's Wall, once again suggesting that they were brought here. We've examined the core of the Brigantes territory, so now let's take a look at their neighbours. To the east we have a very unusual tribe, the Parisii. Their name is identical to a tribe in Gaul, unsurprisingly found around what is now the city of Paris. But this goes further than just a coincidence. You see, the Parisii had a fascinating burial culture, where they would bury carts and vehicles with their dead, a practice that was also carried out by this tribe in Gaul, and sporadically across other parts of northern France. This suggests that there was close cultural contact between the Britons of this region and the Gauls of these regions, beginning, according to what we found so far, by about the 5th or 4th century BC. By the end of the Iron Age though, these cart burials had largely stopped, giving way to individual warrior burials. Ptolemy gives the Parisii only a single town, Petuaria, on the River Humber. But from archaeological records of these cart burials, we can estimate that the Parisii extended their territory right up to the Yorkshire moors, likely between where the Brigantian settlements stop and the North Sea begins. This additional stretch of coast to the north, also devoid of Brigantes towns, might be where this Gabrantovices Bay is located. However, keep in mind that we have no idea for certain, but this would account for this territory that is seemingly absent of both Brigantes and the Parisii. However, at some point this tribe seems to become one of those two coasts that the Brigantes famously stretched between. On the other side of this island, we have another stretch of land completely devoid of Brigantes settlements, the land to the west of the Pennines around Lancaster and Manchester, which might be home to that Setantiorum harbour that Ptolemy mentioned. The people of this harbour, the Setantii, and their local river, the Setea, have mystified historians for decades. Their location isn't specified, but Ptolemy tells us that they're on the western side of Britain, below a place called the Moricam estuary. Moricam comes from the Brythonic Marocam, meaning the great winding or bending, which would be Marcam in modern Welsh, and this name survives today as Morecambe Bay. If we assume that these two bays are the same, then Ptolemy tells us that the Setantii's harbour is right below it, followed by another presumably notable estuary, and finally the river Setea. If we look on a map, we can see two pretty sizable estuaries below Morecambe Bay, the Ribble and the Mersey, and historians today generally agree that the Setea was very likely the Mersey River. This then also placed the Setantiorum harbour somewhere above the Ribble, and the historian Andrew Breeze suggests that it was on the River Wyre near Blackpool today, although the Lune near Lancaster could also be a candidate. This places the Setantii right here, to the west of the Pennines, roughly between the Wyre and the Mersey. Unfortunately, we don't really know anything else about them, but their name might give us one final clue, because it's very weird and it doesn't seem to be Celtic. The historian Dr. Parson suggests that this name might be pre-Indo-European, however Breeze has a different idea. He suggests that the Setantii is a misspelling for the Metantii. Ptolemy spelt words wrong all the time, even of very famous people and locations. And Met is a Celtic word meaning to cut or harvest. It survives in Welsh today as Medel, a reaper, and Medi, the month of harvest, making the Metantii the reaping people. Breeze also suggests that this was a reference not to farmers, but to warriors, as medieval Welsh poetry frequently uses the terms Medi, Medal, Gwr Medal, and Medal Gallon to refer to powerful kings and soldiers, all of which mean reapers, making them the reapers of their enemies. The Setantii, however, seem to have eventually become subservient to their neighbours, the Brigantes, although as I said, we don't know when this happened. Finally, we come to another difficult tribe, the Carvetii. Ptolemy never mentions them, but there was a local government in Britain named after them, the Civitas Carvetiorum, created by AD 229, and based out of the Roman city of Lugualium, known later to the Welsh as Caer Ligualid, Llywelydd, and Caer Lil by the English, becoming Carlisle today. Their territory seems to have spanned from Carlisle in the north to Middleton in the south, where a Roman milestone bearing their name was discovered, along with a few other inscriptions in what is now Penrith. The difficulty of this tribe is that date I mentioned. They were granted a separate government to the Brigantes, but this came very late, meaning that we don't know if they were conquered and haphazardly lumped in with their neighbouring tribe, or if the Brigantes had conquered them, sometime prior to the arrival of the Romans. Aside from the Carvetii, there are 3 other names associated with the northern Brigantes territory. The first comes from another Roman town, this time mentioned in the Ravenna cosmography, a sort of travel book describing various locations in Britain, which provides us with the name Coria Lopocarium. The Coria in Britain were the government centres of the rural provinces, once again naming another tribe within the borders of the Brigantes, the Lopocares. This town was probably Corbridge in the Tyne Valley, which also hosts another inscription, the Curia Tectoverdorum, or the Senate of the Tectoverdi, although this was probably a mistake for another Coria, suggesting yet another unknown tribal government. Finally, we also have the now lost inscription dedicated to the Corionototae, somewhere in this area, of which even less is known. They all evidently had some sort of self-government in the rural regions of the Brigantes province, likely in or around the Tyne Valley, but what sort of independence they may have had prior to the Romans isn't known. As we've been moving north, our information has gotten more and more scarce, and once we move past Hadrian's Wall, it gets even worse, something that is clearly exemplified in Ptolemy's map of Britain. Do you notice what's wrong with it? Scotland, at precisely where Hadrian's Wall is, has been rotated 90 degrees to the right. As Bill Thayer notes in his online translation of Ptolemy's work, Scotland, or Caledonia as the Romans called it, was outside of the Roman Empire. There weren't any cartographers going around mapping coordinates. Instead, Ptolemy probably had to rely on information from sailors, and the number of people who braved, or were even skilled enough to sail all the way around Scotland at this time, were probably very few. That being said, the Romans did, briefly, control this region of modern-day Scotland and England, with a temporary border here at the Antonine Wall, giving us slightly more information on the 4 tribes that Ptolemy claimed lived here: the Votadini, the Selgovae, the Novantae, and the Damnonii. The Votadini supposedly lived on the south coast, which in reality was the east, and they're assigned the Roman fort of Bremenium by Ptolemy. Their capital, though, appears to have been the hill of Triprain Law, owing to the huge amounts of Roman goods and silver here, suggesting that the controllers of this fort had a very beneficial relationship with their Roman neighbours, probably in turn defending them from raids from the northern British tribes. The Votadini would also seem to survive the Roman conquest of Britain, as medieval Welsh poetry referenced the kingdom of the Gwotodyn, later Gododin, in the same area, who, according to legend, sent soldiers down to North Wales to found the kingdom of Gwynedd, although this probably isn't true. They were bordered to the west by the Selgovae, who seem to have had their tribal centre on Eildon Hill, while Ptolemy assigns them 4 Roman forts, of which 2 have been theorised to be at Newstead and Ruber's Law. Both the Votadini and the Selgovae were fairly centralised compared to their western and northern neighbours, with a small number of large hill forts, rather than a large number of small hill forts in their territory. To the west, we're told about 2 more tribes. The first are the Novantae, who have 2 peninsulas named after them, which appear to be around the area of Galloway, and then the Damnonii to their north. Very little is known about these tribes, although the Romans have provided us with a small handful of place names as clues. In any case, from AD 80 to 82, the Roman general Agricola marched his legions north into these tribes, tackling the more centralised east first. The Selgovae appear to have put up the most resistance, as the Romans built a large number of forts, including the main fort of the entire region, within their territory. Meanwhile, the Votadini appear to have been left relatively alone. Once the Novantae in the south were finally conquered in AD 82, Agricola apparently looked over the sea to Ireland, estimating that it could be conquered by a single legion, although this never came to be. Finally, we look over Caledonia, northern Scotland, the land that was never conquered by the Roman Empire, although Agricola did find victories here, against a people that by the 8th century were being called Picts. Who exactly the Picts were is argued about, and when exactly they appeared is argued about even more. A long time ago they were thought to be the last remnants of the pre-Celtic people of Britain. However, today their remarkably Celtic language and the fact that no one mentions them until about the 3rd century has instead led to theories that their culture developed out of Brythonic, rather than preceding it. Perhaps, as Charles Edwards suggests, the fact that these tribes lay outside of the bounds of the Roman Empire may have caused a divergence between them and their linguistic relatives to the south. Beginning on the western coast, Ptolemy names the tribe of the Epidii as living along and above a peninsula bearing their name, likely this very notable peninsula in southern Argyll. He then names the Creones to the north of them, and then the Carnonacae above them. On the north coast we find the Caerenii, and finally the Cornavii in Caithness. To the south he names the Lugi, and above them, to the west, we have the Smertae, where we can find a burial mound bearing their name, Carn Smers. Finally, on this side of Loch Ness in the Great Glen Fault, we have the Decantae. An interesting fact about these western or Atlantic tribes is that they almost entirely lacked iron, instead using animal bones and bronze to fashion nails, combs and tools. Moving east, Ptolemy names a tribe known as the Vacomagi, to which 4 places are assigned: Banatia, Tamea, Penatacastra and Tuesis. The locations of these are debated, but Ptolemy's own coordinates would appear to place the Vacomagi across northeastern Scotland, straddling the Grampian Mountains. Historians generally consider this quite unlikely, and they tend to prefer to place them on one side or the other. Sir Ian Richmond placed them to the south, but Mann and Breeze placed them to the north on the coast, and we don't yet have enough information to know who, if anyone, is correct. In northeastern Scotland we have the Taezali, and finally, to the south we have the Venicones, who likely occupied the eastern lowlands. We very quickly breeze through all of those names, but that's because we have hardly anything to go off of, just Ptolemy's description. That being said, there is one final puzzle to solve: the Caledonii. You may have noticed that all of these tribes occupy some sort of coastland, because as I mentioned earlier, Ptolemy very likely had to rely on the accounts of sailors, who would obviously only encounter the coastal tribes. So who was living in this giant inland stretch of highlands? No other names are mentioned except for the Caledonii, who were told stretched from 2 estuaries, probably somewhere around the Great Glen Fault. We could assume that they were some lesser tribe occupying the hills to the south of Loch Ness, and indeed that was the opinion of Mann and Breeze, who theorised that the Caledonii had been pushed inland by the coastal tribes to the east, sinking into insignificance. This, however, has been vehemently refused by the historian G. Barrow, who notes 3 points. First, the Romans called this entire area Caledonia, the land of the Caledonii. The great forest that spanned central Scotland was, for centuries, known as the Caledonian Forest. And even the name for the Western Ocean, Dun Caledonius, contains the Caledonii name. The Romans also referred to individuals as the Caledonians, and some are very highly commemorated, such as Losio Weda, who was commemorated in Colchester. The name Caledonia even survives today, both as a noun but also in place names. These are hardly the symptoms of an insignificant group, they instead appear to be heavily associated with central Scotland, suggesting that maybe it was them who occupied this big empty space in the centre. Sailors on the coast wouldn't have encountered them apart from their 2 ports in the north and the west, hence why Ptolemy perhaps doesn't mention them very much. Between AD 83 and 84, the Romans, again under Agricola, pushed further into this region of Scotland, culminating at the Battle of Mons Graupius, likely somewhere on the Grampian Mountains, where we're told an army of 30,000 Caledonians, led by a man named Calgacus, were supposedly fought and defeated, but the conquest of Britain deserves its own video. This completes the very brief survey of the northern Celtic tribes of Britain prior to the Roman invasion. If you'd like to learn about the Celtic tribes of the south, then that video already exists and you can click it here. If you'd like me to cover any more of these tribes in more detail, feel free to leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.